Hi everyone, it's Ruby G.
And I'm Joff.
Welcome to Truth in Neurons.
Today we're examining what may be the most physically constraining element of the Idaho case prosecution theory, the timeline. Not the timeline of the overall night, but the specific claim that Brian Kohberger committed 4 separate homicides involving extensive struggle, defensive wounds, and skull fractures in approximately 3 to 5 minutes. As over 2,000 crime scene photographs have now been released with reduced redactions, we can finally see what this timeline actually required. And what we see raises fundamental questions not about guilt or innocence, but about the basic laws of physics, human movement, and the mechanics of violence. This isn't about psychology. This isn't about witness credibility. This is about whether a human body can move through space, execute complex violent actions against resisting victims, and exit a scene in the time frame that the prosecution has asserted. When we examine the newly released photographs showing the extent of struggle in multiple rooms, when we consider the documented injuries, including skull fractures requiring significant force, when we map the physical layout of the house and the necessary movements between floors and rooms, we face a timeline that leaves virtually no margin for error. And when we overlay this timeline with the known characteristics of the defendant, documented developmental coordination disorder, ADHD, OCD, and sensory sensitivities requiring the use of earplugs, we encounter not just improbability, but something approaching physical impossibility.
Let's be absolutely precise about what the prosecution's 3 to 5 minute window must accommodate. This isn't speculation. This is based on the physical evidence visible in the newly released photographs, the autopsy findings that are part of the court record, and the basic mechanisms of human movement through a 3-story house. The timeline must include exterior approach from vehicle to the entry point, which even at a rapid pace requires at least 20 seconds. Vertical movement up at least 1 staircase requiring 5 to 8 seconds per flight. Navigation to the first victim location, engagement with the first victim or victims during which defence wounds were inflicted as documented in autopsy reports, positioning to a second location on a different floor, engagement with and incapacitation of second set of victims, again involving struggle evidenced by defensive wounds and environmental damage visible in crime scene photos. And finally, exit back through the house and to the vehicle. When we do the mathematics conservatively, and I mean conservatively, giving every benefit of doubt to speed and efficiency, movement alone consumes 45 to 60 seconds of a 180 second window. That leaves 120 to 135 seconds maximum for the actual violent encounters with 4 victims. The crime scene photographs show us what those encounters involved.
Let's examine what this timeline demands from the perpetrator's motor system, because this is where the newly available information about Brian Kohberger's documented conditions becomes not just relevant, but potentially dispositive. The scenario requires rapid room-to-room navigation in an unfamiliar house layout, under conditions of poor lighting, balance and stability while ascending and descending stairs, potentially while carrying a weapon and managing adrenaline-induced physiological changes, precise targeting under resistance. Victims with defensive wounds are by definition resisting, which means The attacker must control moving, fighting targets. There'd be sustained grip strength throughout multiple violent encounters without dropping the weapon. Dynamic reaction to counterforce when victims fight back. Weapon retention under struggle conditions, and avoidance of self-injury despite engaging in chaotic close-quarters violence. These are not trivial motor demands. These are high-coordination tasks that would challenge even individuals with intact motor planning and execution systems. He has been diagnosed with developmental coordination disorder, a condition characterised by impaired fine motor control, difficulty with rapid sequencing, and reduced physiomotor integration. Observers who knew him have noted he had difficulty with basic fine motor tasks like buttoning shirts. His handwriting was reportedly poor, another marker of DCD affecting fine motor control. From a forensic standpoint, DCD adversely affects precisely the systems required for this scenario the prosecution describes. Motor planning, the ability to rapidly sequence complex physical actions, is impaired. Visiomotor integration, the ability to coordinate what you see with what your hands and body do, is reduced. Fine motor execution under stress would be compromised. The forensic literature on DCD is clear. Individuals with clinically significant motor coordination impairments show slower execution of complex tasks, increased sequencing errors, higher likelihood of dropping objects, and poor recovery after slips or collisions. These are not personality traits or tendencies. These are neurological constraints on what the motor system can reliably execute, especially under extreme stress.
In Zana Kronodal's room, we see gouges in the flooring consistent with someone clawing desperately for purchase. We see damage to furniture from impacts during struggle. We see blood spatter patterns on walls at varying heights indicating dynamic movement, not static positioning. The autopsy reports document skull fractures in both Zana and Kaylee, injuries that require significant force to produce. The human skull evolved specifically to protect the brain from impact, fracturing it particularly in the context of stabbing attacks, where the primary weapon is a blade, requires either multiple strikes to the same area or strikes of extraordinary force. The newly released photographs also show what happens to be cast-off blood spatter. The pattern created when a blood-covered object, like a knife, is swung through the air between strikes. This indicates multiple strikes per victim, movement of both attacker and victims, and continuation of assault after initial wounds are inflicted. This is not the forensic signature of quick, efficient killing. This is a signature of prolonged chaotic violence. And all of this in separate locations with 4 separate victims. And according to Gilbertson's theory, this must fit into approximately 120 seconds, which is ridiculous. The sensory dimension of this timeline presents an additional layer of impossibility that becomes clear when we understand what the crime scene photographs actually show. A rapid, multi-victim, close-quarters stabbing creates an environment that is extremely loud with screaming, impacts, furniture strikes, and the specific sounds of violent struggle. Chaotic with unpredictable movement, blood, collisions, and constantly changing spatial relationships. Sensory dense, with intense visual, auditory, and tactile stimuli all occurring simultaneously. And unpredictable, with victims responding in ways that cannot be anticipated or controlled. For someone with documented sensory hypersensitivity, severe enough to require earplugs in normal environments, this sensory environment would be catastrophically overwhelming. The clinical literature on autism and sensory processing is unambiguous. Individuals with heightened sensory sensitivity experience intense psychological distress in chaotic multisensory environments. This distress manifests as increased disorientation, impairment of rapid task switching, elevated panic or shutdown risk, and reduced fine motor control under sensory overload.
Multiple attackers would explain how 4 victims in different rooms could be attacked within a compressed time frame without the timeline breaking. If 2 or 3 people are acting simultaneously or in rapid sequence, 3 minutes becomes much more feasible. Multiple attackers would explain the absence of blood transfer in common areas if some attackers had roles that didn't involve direct violence, perhaps controlling access points, preventing escape, or managing logistics when designated attackers inflict injuries. Multiple attackers would explain how a house containing 6 adults, including a large athletic male, could be controlled without any victim escaping or effectively alerting others. One person trying to manage that many potential threats faces exponentially increasing difficulty. Multiple people can establish control much more reliably. Multiple attackers would explain the apparent evidence of cleanup. If some participants focused on violence while others focused on evidence management, then cleanup in a 3-minute window, it's impossible for one person. But for 3 or 4 people working in parallel, it might become achievable. Multiple weapons would explain any variation in wound patterns that might be difficult to attribute to a single implement. Most importantly, multiple perpetrators, including individuals already present in the house, would explain the single most difficult forensic question. How did all of this occur without Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk, who were present, awake, and active on their phones? How did they not recognise and respond to the violence that was occurring only feet away from them?
This brings us back to Dylan and Bethany. Not to accuse them of anything, but to examine what their reported experiences tell us about the timeline and the scenario. The newly released photographs show us what the violence in Zana and Ethan's room looked like. This wasn't quiet. This wasn't quick. The gouges in the floor, the damaged furniture, the blood spatter on walls. These are physical signatures of struggle that produce noise. Bodies hitting furniture produce impact sounds. Hands clawing at floors and furniture produce scraping, scratching sounds. Furniture being displaced produces dragging and collision sounds. The human voice under extreme stress produces vocalizations, even if attempts are made to suppress them. Dylan's room was on the same floor as Zana and Ethan's room. Dylan stated in interviews that you can hear everything in this house. Yet she reported experiences that night involving hearing what she thought was Kaylee playing with her dog, later some crying she attributed to Kaylee, and seeing a masked figure leave, but no sustained sounds of violent struggle from the room 20 feet away. The acoustic mismatch between what the physical evidence shows occurred and what was reportedly heard is not a small discrepancy. It is a fundamental impossibility. Human auditory systems are specifically evolved to detect sounds of violence and distress. These sounds trigger automatic arousal and attention, even from deep sleep. The sounds of the struggle visible in the crime scene photographs occurring in a room 20 feet away from standard walls would have been immediately distinctive, immediately recognisable as a violent struggle, and immediately alarming, unless Dylan was not present or was present in a dissociative state so profound she couldn't form memories, which is contradicted by her extensive phone activity.
I want to be extremely clear about something before proceeding. Discussing Brian Koberger's documented DCD is not making a character judgment. We're not suggesting people with developmental coordination disorders are incapable of violence and not stereotyping a neurological condition. This is a constraints analysis. DCD creates specific measurable limitations in motor planning and execution. These limitations are relevant when evaluating whether someone could perform specific motor tasks under specific conditions in a specific time frame, period. This is no different from considering whether someone with documented knee injuries could have executed movements requiring rapid pivoting, or whether someone with documented vision impairment could have made accurate assessments requiring visual acuity. The forensic literature on DCD establishes several facts that are not in dispute. Individuals with DCD show impaired motor planning, meaning the ability to rapidly sequence complex physical actions is reduced. They show reduced automaticity, meaning the ability to rapidly sequence complex physical actions is reduced, i.e. tasks that typically become automatic with practice remain effortful and attention demanding. They show poor performance under time pressure, with accuracy declining sharply when speed demands increase. And they show vulnerability to motor breakdown under stress, with performance degrading more rapidly than neurotypical individuals when arousal increases. These are not stereotypes or assumptions. These are empirically documented characteristics of the condition. Now, apply these documented constraints to the scenario the prosecution describes. The perpetrator or perpetrators must execute a complex, multi-stage task involving navigation through an unfamiliar environment, rapid transitions between different motor demands such as walking, gripping, striking, controlling, repositioning, precise targeting of moving, resisting subjects, sustained grip control to avoid dropping the weapon, and all of this under the most extreme stress possible. Active violence, potential for being injured, time pressure, and sensory chaos. This is exactly the kind of scenario where DCD-related motor planning deficits would be most likely to manifest. Not maybe, not possibly, most likely. The research is clear on this. What we should expect to see if someone with documented DCD committed this crime in the time frame alleged are specific error signatures, extended time on task because motor planning is less efficient, dropped or fumbled objects during high complexity phases, evidence of slowed movement or hesitation at transition points, possible self-injury from reduced coordination under stress, and increased likelihood of leaving evidence because motor control is impaired. The newly released photographs show some evidence consistent with prolonged struggle, but they don't clearly show the other predicted error signatures. More importantly, the timeline itself contradicts what DCD research would predict. It requires exactly the kind of rapid, error-free motor execution that this neurological profile makes most difficult. It's unfortunate that invisible disabilities are just that. They're invisible to those that don't understand, including those who do timed runs through a crime scene pretending that their times actually would match any perpetrator with a neurological condition. Absolute bullshit. We're not asserting that the prosecution engaged in misconduct or that the judge was biased. What we are asserting, based on the newly released crime scene photographs and the documented evidence and the basic fucking principles of physics and human motor capacity, is this. The prosecution's theory that Brian Koberger committed these crimes alone in a 3 to 5 minute window is so fucking constrained by physical impossibilities and so dependent on the simultaneous occurrence of multiple, highly improbable conditions that it should not have been accepted without rigorous adversarial testing at trial. The timeline requires error-free motor execution from someone with documented motor planning deficits. It requires perfect sensory integration from someone with documented sensory processing difficulties. It requires zero behavioural manifestations of OCD in an environment of absolute fucking chaos. It requires victims not to flee despite multiple escape routes, and it requires witnesses 20 fucking feet away to not recognise violent struggle sounds. It requires 8 hours in a house with decomposing bodies to produce no olfactory awareness. It requires extensive blood evidence in victims' rooms to coexist with virtually no transfer evidence in common areas, with no time for cleanup. Each of these might be explainable individually through some backwards special pleading, and although that's unlikely but technically possible, all of these together, this is not reasonable doubt. This is reasonable impossibility. The exclusion of Brent Turvey's expert testimony, the resolution of the case through a plea before these constraints could be examined, and the media's fucking amplification of certainty where the evidence shows sweet fuck all, to be frank. These represent a systemic failure that should trouble anyone who values forensic integrity over narrative convenience. The newly released photographs don't show us a crime that could have been committed in 3 minutes by one person with the defendant's documented conditions. They show us a crime that required more time, possibly more people, and certainly more fucking explanation than we've been given. Until these constraints are addressed rather than assumed away, this case remains concluded, not resolved. They're very fucking different things.